In my last video, I introduced the minimal facts argument for the resurrection and examined its use of inference to the best explanation. Although minimal facts apologetics places finding the best explanation as the central issue when analyzing evidence for the resurrection, we saw quite conclusively in the last video that it may be irrational to believe in the resurrection, whether it's the best explanation or not. So in this video, I will proceed to argue against the resurrection without seeking or defending an explanation for the apologists' lists of minimal facts, though I will continue to generously grant those purported facts for the sake of argument. Now, in the debates I've been citing, believe it or not, I think the skeptics Bart, Ehrman, and Matt Dillahunty both take positions that are overly dogmatic, to the effect that appealing to historical evidence in the way Craig and Licona are doing is in principle insufficient to demonstrate the occurrence of a miracle. Not only is this wrong, but it plays right into the apologists' hands, allowing them to appear as reasonable empiricists, simply going wherever the evidence leads, in contrast to the willfully close-minded skeptics. So let me be clear. In my view, you can, in theory, prove a miracle happened the same way you prove anything else. No one ever has, but that's not because it's impossible in principle. It's because, they're not real. I also think it's a mistake to frame this as an issue of whether miracles or the supernatural exist if all we're really asking is, did Jesus rise from the dead? I'll talk more about that later. So, are you ready to hear why I don't think Jesus came back to life? Here we go. It's because dead people don't come back to life! Boom! Checkmate, Christian. No, but for real though, that is my actual argument. In fact, let me present it here in the form of a syllogism. Now, obviously, that second premise is gonna ruffle a few feathers, but this video isn't directed at those people. The real strength of the argument depends on how well I can defend that first premise, that no one has ever come back from the dead. After all, it is an extremely bold claim, right? I mean, it shouldn't be. To me, this belongs in the same category as statements like, no dog has ever given birth to a kitten, or no human walked on the moon prior to 1969. But if there were popular religions based on denying those claims, I'd gladly defend them as well, so let's get on with it. Now, the argument here is a textbook case of induction, simple as can be. We have historical records going back thousands of years all over the world. Although there are many myths and legends, it is extremely rare for a remotely credible source to claim that a human or any closely related animal came back to life, and we have no physical evidence for any such events we can examine. Today, 150,000 people die every day, and none of them comes back to life. We also have no well-supported theory that suggests dead people may come back to life. Therefore, we reasonably conclude no dead person has ever come back to life. But surely this whole argument is irrelevant, right? Because we have evidence that Jesus came back to life. And if we have good evidence that even one person came back to life, that disproves the claim that nobody ever came back to life. Am I not just engaged in circular reasoning here, assuming Jesus didn't resurrect in order to prove he didn't, ignoring the actual evidence to the contrary? No, that's not what I'm doing. To explain why, you'll have to bear with me for a moment while we talk about false positives. If you have a test that is supposed to confirm when something is the case, no matter how accurate it is, it'll never be perfectly accurate. It will always have a certain chance of giving a false positive, where it says the thing is the case, but it actually isn't. And it's important to know, or at least have some idea, how high that chance is when you apply the test. To demonstrate this, here's an example that's often used to introduce people to the concept of Bayes' theorem, an important mathematical equation that can be used to answer questions like this. Suppose that a test for using a particular drug is 99% sensitive, meaning it will produce 99% true positive results for drug users, and 99% specific, meaning it will produce 99% true negative results for non-drug users. Suppose that 0.5% of people are users of the drug. What is the probability that a randomly selected individual with a positive test is a drug user? Feel free to just take a guess before I tell you the answer. Are you ready? The chance is about 1 in 3. That's a 1 in 3 chance of the person with a positive result actually being a drug user. Surprising? How can that be when the test is so accurate? Well, to put it simply, it's because even though false positives are very rare, actual drug users among the general population are even rarer, in this hypothetical example at least. Now let's imagine another scenario where we're not sure whether anyone actually uses the drug or not. We give the test to 1,000 people and get 10 positives. Do those 10 positive results prove that some people do use the drug? Of course not, because that's how many positives we would expect even if there were no drug users in the sample. So how does this apply to the resurrection? Apologists present evidence for the resurrection in the form of lists of minimal facts. They claim this evidence provides enough support to confirm that it happened. So we can take the level of evidence being met here as a test we could apply to other resurrection claims. Any claimed resurrection that has as much evidential support as this, that is, a missing body, a few people think they saw the guy, one of them is someone you'd expect to be initially skeptical, and they seem to really believe it, if it has that much evidence, it's confirmed. Now, I can grant this is a pretty accurate standard in the sense that it will dismiss almost all false resurrection claims. Now let's take this and apply it to every resurrection claim in history. So how many of those are there? Well, obviously a lot. There are countless tales in folklore and legend of dead people walking the earth in some form or another, and there are also numerous religions that claim various figures came back to life, including several biblical stories about people other than Jesus being resurrected. Gary Habermas, the originator of the minimal facts argument, examines some resurrection claims in non-Christian religions in his article, Resurrection Claims in Non-Christian Religions. It seems that the very idea of humans coming back from the dead is an endless source of fascination that is very liable to spawn legends. And how many of them pass our test? How many of them have as much evidence as these minimal facts for Jesus provide? Well, I think most skeptics and apologists can agree that it's somewhere between 0 and 1. Some would argue that not even Jesus passes the test because the minimal facts are not actually established facts in his case. But I think not even apologists would argue that the other biblical resurrection stories have as much evidential support as Jesus's, and few people in either camp think that the non-Christian resurrection stories have much of a leg to stand on. So when applying our test to all of these many resurrection claims, we get, let's be generous and call it 1 positive. That's good, right? It means Jesus succeeds where other resurrections fail. Well, remember the drug tests. We should ask, how often can we expect a false positive result from this resurrection validation test when applied to a fake resurrection story? 1% of the time? 5%? Could it be as low as 0.1%? That's really low. Let's cut to the chase. How likely is it that if all resurrection claims were false, as I believe they are, there would be at least one resurrection claim out of all of them, at least one, that nevertheless manages to meet this standard of evidence just as a fluke? Pretty substantial, I would think. But in that case, the fact that there is one such case doesn't overturn the hypothesis that no dead person has ever come back to life. And since that hypothesis is otherwise overwhelmingly supported, we rationally should be confident in it, which means we should be confident in what follows deductively from it, that Jesus didn't rise from the dead. This argument against the resurrection is analogous to the second drug test example from earlier, but we can also present a weaker version of the argument analogous to the first drug test example. Even if resurrections do sometimes happen but are extremely rare, say there have only been a handful throughout history, it is unclear at best whether this test would be enough to prove Jesus resurrected in spite of the rarity of such an event. Remember, you need an extremely accurate test in order to confirm a specific instance of an extremely rare event, which is to say, as it is so often said, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But I hear you say, you can't reject the resurrection because it's a unique event. That's like the whole point of it. That's what makes it special and proof of Jesus' godhood. And I hear you, but if it is such a unique event that so defies the normal working of reality, then I'm just saying you need a lot more evidence than this to reasonably believe it happened. Now you might notice that in that entire argument I never talked about how Jesus' resurrection is supernatural or a miracle or an act of God. Apologists use this as their ace in the hole for defending the plausibility of the resurrection. Sure, we all know people don't rise from the dead, naturally, but there's no reason they couldn't rise from the dead supernaturally, right?
But that's not all. Notice that Dr. Ehrman just assumes that the probability of the resurrection on our background knowledge is very low. But here I think he's confused. What, after all, is the resurrection hypothesis? It is the hypothesis that Jesus rose supernaturally from the dead. It is not the hypothesis that Jesus rose naturally from the dead. That Jesus rose naturally from the dead is fantastically improbable. But I see no reason whatsoever to think that it is improbable that God raised Jesus from the dead.
Mike Licona even devotes a substantial part of his opening statement to arguing that the supernatural exists, opening with, no kidding, a spooky ghost story that totally happened to someone he knows.
So as they're playing the Ouija board, all of a sudden, they saw the lid, the metal lid on the can, just lift up and hover over the can for a moment, and then it launched itself against the wall, hits the wall, goes flat against the wall, and it's as though someone was holding it against the wall, and then it just slid down real slowly down the wall, and then when it hit the ground, it started to spin like a coin.
Well, can't argue with that. So what am I going to do now that Licona has proved beyond a doubt the existence of the supernatural through this and other astonishing tales? How high should our confidence be that no dead person has ever come back to life now? Well, I say high. They say low. You say why? And I say, because dead people don't come back to life! I'm afraid of sounding like a broken record here, but I want to be perfectly clear. What the overwhelming evidence suggests is that dead people don't come back to life at all. They don't do it naturally, and they don't do it supernaturally either, because they just don't do it. They don't do it without divine intervention, and they don't do it with divine intervention either. If you believe in God, then the most rational conclusion for you to reach is that God has never raised someone from the dead. Sure, he could, but only in the trivial sense that he could do absolutely anything. That's not a reason to think that it might actually happen. I mean, he could decide to turn all the world's oranges blue on January 1st, 2050. He's God. He could do that. But so what?
You might argue that resurrections, our background knowledge shows that they don't occur. Well, it shows that they don't occur by natural causes.
No, it suggests that they don't occur, period. It would be different if there was some kind of voodoo ritual that could reliably bring people back from the dead, and this was widely known about. But as it stands, our background knowledge is heavily weighted against resurrections of any kind whatsoever, not just natural ones. Dead people don't come back to life.
So, for example, we could say this 3-year-old girl, if I said this 3-year-old girl bench pressed 300 pounds, we'd say implausible. But what if we have this muscle man, a bodybuilder, who's got his hands on the barbell and he lifts it and assists her? Well, then all bets are off. That's a game changer, right? And the plausibility of her doing it on her own, it's off the table. Same thing with raising from the dead by natural causes, implausible. But if God exists and wants to raise Jesus, all bets are off. That's a game changer.
Sure, if God exists and he wants to raise Jesus from the dead, he would do that. I mean, you would think. But those are some pretty big ifs. Are we just assuming that they're true?
He says that I would have to assume that God exists and wanted to raise Jesus. No, I wouldn't. Nowhere in my argument did I assume that God existed or wanted to raise Jesus. Like I said, you look at the data, you let the data speak for themselves apart from presuppositions. I mean, that's what a good historian is going to do. It's going to allow the data to challenge our presuppositions, to challenge our current worldview.
Okay, good. In fact, Licona even thinks it goes the other way.
And I think if Jesus rose from the dead, then that gives you God and Christianity. It gives you the probability of God. It certainly gives you Jesus rose, it gives you the supernatural realm, and it probably gives you God.
This threw me for a bit, but here's my best understanding of Licona's argument. He's relying on his arguments for the supernatural to make the divine intervention at least plausible. But of course, it doesn't do that. Even if the supernatural exists, even if God exists, it doesn't change the fact that dead people don't come back to life. After all, God doesn't go around raising other people from the dead. So what we really need is an argument for why Jesus is special. What evidence is there that he would be a target of special divine interest such that he might be raised from the dead? How about the fact that he claimed to be the Son of God and predicted a resurrection?
At that point, based on our understanding of natural law, we are right to infer a supernatural cause, especially when you have Jesus claiming that he's God's uniquely divine Son and predicts his resurrection from the dead. We are well within our epistemic rights to say this is probably what happened, that Jesus rose and it was because God raised him from the dead.
Well, first of all, I don't remember Jesus predicting his resurrection being one of those minimal facts, and rightly so, because it could quite easily be made up. But suppose Jesus did predict his own resurrection. Is that supposed to be evidence that it happened? Wouldn't telling his followers to expect him to come back from the dead be more likely to make them falsely conclude he came back from the dead, even if it didn't happen? Wouldn't that actually weaken the argument for the resurrection? What about them prophecies? That's one that I've heard. Didn't he fulfill loads of prophecies from the Old Testament? Well, when you actually look into it, the claims of prophetic fulfillment in the New Testament are sort of pathetic. This is going beyond the scope of this video, so I recommend you check out Profmth Mitch's series, Jesus Was Not the Messiah.
The fatal flaw here is that the so-called messianic prophetic portrait is largely a Christian fiction that, among other things, regularly relies on fabricated prophecies, as well as tendentious misquotations and misapplications of passages from the Hebrew Scriptures.
What about Jesus' profound moral teachings? Surely no mere man could have delivered such universal truths. Well, no, having good moral teachings isn't some superhuman ability, and frankly I don't think Jesus's are even that impressive in terms of originality or truth. But I guess that's a whole other debate too. In conclusion, the evidence for Jesus being someone for whom God would bend the rules of life and death is totally lacking, and in the absence of such evidence, the case for a divine resurrection can't fare much better than the case for a natural one. That is to say, it's monumentally unlikely. In the next and final video of this series, I'll address some alternative explanations for the resurrection and some other loose ends.